energy healing is the ability to focus attention intelligently, concisely, in order to affect healing, change, and transformation for the body, in order to uphold highest health, ultimately divine embodiment, total awakening of awareness. In energy healing, we need a context to focus awareness, because the focusing part's easy. We've always been doing that. But the hard part is, where do we focus and how do we focus in order to elicit the precise results or effects that we want from the physiology? So for that, we need a map to understand the landscape, because what we're really doing is bringing awareness around to focus on consciousness. Basically, awareness is focusing on its own nature, because awareness, pure consciousness, pure attention, pure perception is the very stuff of which the source of creation is comprised. So if everything comes from the source of creation, what we're doing is we're taking the bit of it that we own, that we have mastery over, and we're flipping it around and turning it back on the source. And that accomplishes several things. For one thing, the source of creation thrills at its own self-referral loops. So when we do that, that has this lovely nourishing effect for ourselves and for our environment, even no matter where the awareness lands, no matter where it lands, just the intention to turn it around and bring it back into the source alone has this effect of uplifting. Consciousness is like an ocean. It's big and unbounded. The universe is big. The universe is like little compared to the field of pure consciousness, to the source of the universe. The source of the universe is infinite, eternal, massive, beyond massive. So how do we find our way around? How do we navigate our little ship? We need some points of reference. So the points of reference are continuums from infinity to infinity along certain specific lines. One of them goes from concrete to abstract. That means from physical level of self down to more abstract, like mental, emotional levels of self, down to more abstract to the source of creation. You've got infinity at one end, and I talked about that yesterday, and infinity at the other end. Another point of reference is the range from horrible to wonderful, which can also go, I know, ooh, we're actually going to talk quite a bit about that today. So that also can go from infinitely horrible to infinitely wonderful. Another point of reference is from infinitely small to infinitely large. And another point of reference, one of my favorites, is from infinitely asleep to infinitely awake. And we're going to talk about that today too. Okay, so that just gives us a sense of some coordinates, so that when I make reference to them, you know what I'm talking about. Thanks for being with me on that. So we have this folding of creation in on itself, which is the fundamental movement of consciousness responsible for everything that's manifest, everything. And I refer to that sometimes as the divine dialogue, because it's divinity speaking to itself. It's folding in on itself. And every time it loops in, a little bit of, like a little boundary or a little density, a little manifestation comes out of that folding. If we look at the divine dialogue in the context of what I would call the y-axis, which is from dense to subtle, we see the folding going from what we know as physical material reality down to what we don't know, less understood, more the unknown, into the field of silence. And then the silence warms up, and then it remanifests. And these are these 4 steps. There's a collapse. This is the first phase of the gap, is the collapse into silence. Then the second phase of the gap is the silence, and that's infinite silence. The third phase is warming up the silence. And the fourth phase is emerging back out into the relative expression. Your celestial healing collective sits at that very interesting spot between the silence and where it warms up. And it also extends the parts you're familiar with and you know about, which I said I'd mentioned it, angels and so forth. That comes at the very, very first manifestations out of the warmed up silence. So we need to look, I know why yesterday we had to be so abstract, because we're working today and yesterday in this very deep, deep level of awareness. Not at the surface where we can describe things, that's blue, that's purple. No, not so simple. It's at a very abstract level where the defined boundaries are not as well commonly experienced or well understood. Okay, so when a problem occurs, illness resides in the physiology, we start with a symptom, which is on the surface. This is the healing algorithm. It's the same as the divine dialogue. You can see lots of videos of this, and there's a page on my knowledge base. Okay, so we start with the symptom, and from the symptom, we take a dive into silence. This is a kind of you could say that awareness collapses into silence. We could say that it falls into silence. But the field of silence is the pure field of consciousness. And it's huge, it's unbounded, it's eternal, it's massive. So what's happening is we're going from an expressed value into an unmanifest, unexpressed, eternal, huge ocean of self. And in that ocean, what being can do, what it can do, is it can know itself. That's what it does. It knows itself. And because it's completely unbounded and eternal, the act of knowing itself is a kind of a collapse of the unbounded eternal nature into a point of reference. The collapse into a point of reference is the fundamental for the warming up of the silence. So that's why I'm talking about, I know it seems really abstract, but that's why we're talking about this, is because we need to understand what exactly precisely happens at that magical spot. Because as we know from the healing algorithm, we start with the imbalance, we drop into the field of absolute silence. Out of the silence comes antidotes and solutions and healings. So what exactly happens right at that spot where the healings come out? We have to understand it. Okay, so the infinite, unbounded ocean of being looks upon its own nature. And when it looks, but it hasn't manifested anything yet. And when that happens, there's a collapse. And the collapse is from I'm infinite, unbounded, absolute nature to I am infinite, unbounded, absolute nature looking at myself. As soon as it does that, divisions are created. The division of I who is looking, myself who's being looked at, the act of looking, right? So that's the very delicate dynamic that's going on down at that level. And so a three in one division is created. Out of this 3-in-1 division, because it stays in silence, there's also a 2 division. There's a I'm infinite, unbounded silence, I've collapsed. Those two are also happening. So, and then in that collapse, it says, oh, but I'm really 3. So in the 2 strokes of I'm infinite, unbounded, and I've collapsed, we can also see the 2 sides of the divine dialogue, or the 2 strokes of the healing algorithm, which is I've collapsed. I collapse into the silence. And from the silence, it's like, oh, wow, I created something. And the solution creates forward. Okay, so that's the context. It's a little abstract, but we're going to play with it a little bit so we kind of get to know it better in the context of more healing for everyone. So looking into the group at this point, thank you everyone for being with me. It's very exciting. And what I'm feeling is just a very, very tender, very delicate little waking up of understanding. Waking up. And so what this means is we've made contact with a part of our own being, the part of our celestial healing collective, which knows. So the part that knows wakes up. Now, what it's doing is it's illuminating the emergence of pure consciousness or awareness from the source. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at, let's see, this level. If we've got our y-axis from very concrete down to very subtle, we're going to look at these two deep levels. This is pure silence and this is warmed up silence, okay? But we're going to look at this level, which is the causal level of self. And the reason is that's where we actually find those structures of self that we identify with healing angels and forms of intelligence and capability which have the power to influence natural law. They have the power to work with the laws of nature and create specific effects. Everything is born out of that silence, right? So really that's the real key, and it's that spot right between the silence and the warmed up silence. That's where everything comes. We mustn't forget that. That's the witness. That's the part that's looking at these more expressed forms. Now, this causal body, I haven't really done a video on it, but I should. The causal body is understood in 7 sheaths or layers. So the more compactified layers are closer to the physiology, and then the less compactified layers are further out, and they can go way out, like way out. It's kind of like a very big level of self. So the causal level, the physiology, is the deepest, most refined physical manifested expression of the physiology. So at that level, we are all like as big as the universe, right? Because as long as we can conceive it, as long as you can think, oh, there is a universe, that means there's a part of you that's as big as the universe. If you thought it, the thought was as big as the universe, that belonged to you. So at the surface, we're a little person, so many feet tall, so many inches wide. And then as we get into the deeper, more abstract levels of self, we get really big, all the way big to as big as the universe. So the outermost sheath, the most abstract sheath, the sheath that's closest to the silence is big. 7 sheaths or 7 rays. Sometimes they call them the 7 rays of the causal body, or 7 layers, however you like to define it. The inner layers are universal expressions of self, which we talked about a bit yesterday when I referenced archetypes. And I would say that first layer, that first closest layer to the physiology, is the layer where you find your archetypes. The next layer out is where you find the divine beings, the celestial beings, the devas, the angels, these expressions of self. The next layer out is where we find the larger, more like intense, profound, longer lived beings, more invincible beings. And then the next layer out, the 4th layer out, we find the gods and the pantheons of gods are in the 4th layer. And they sit at a kind of gap between aspects or expressions of self which have animate qualities to them, like the gods. You kind of think of them as like, well, they kind of look like humans, right? See these lovely paintings of them. They have heads and eyes and noses, just like we do. So, so there's still an element of, oh yeah, I can kind of relate to that. It's sort of like me. But it sits at the junction between the part that I could relate to, kind of seems like me, to the part that doesn't seem like me. And those last 3 layers represent the realms of creation, from smaller realms to larger realms. And so what this means is that there is an aspect of all of us which is large enough that it's not like a person, it's like a place. if that makes sense. And this is the realms are very important parts of our celestial healing collective, because any healing that we decide to do for ourselves is going to be founded on positioning, self-positioning. I talked a lot about that yesterday in terms of balance, but self-positioning in a space of creation where the laws of nature support that particular healing process. And it's like, you've heard me say this before, it's like a house. In the house, there's a room, there are rooms that are better for cooking and other rooms that are better for sleeping. We don't go to the cooking room to sleep because that just wouldn't work. We don't go to the sleeping room to cook, right? So the realms of creation go from smaller realms to larger realms. And they even go from like very, very, very small. So each cell has its own little home, its own little homey realm around it like that, all the way out to vast universal size realms. And the realms house the laws of nature. They provide context for the laws of nature. And there are many realms that I know of. I've done a lot of exploring in that area. I needed to because it helps people heal, but also it's fascinating. And it's the armchair traveler here. It's a beautiful field of exploration. It's a beautiful field. All of the sizes and contexts and types of realms range along the x-axis. They have their range along the x-axis from like not pleasant to very pleasant. And that's important. That's important when it comes to beings like angels. I actually just am going to read part of this question because a question came in, and I feel that this lady who is like an angel, she's an angel, who asked this question, really hit it on the head. And I'd like to kind of keep this question close for the whole of today's webinar. Descriptions of what the experiences of our celestial healing collective might be like. How one might experience this as angelic or ascended masters, as you mentioned last night. More specifics about the mechanics of how we gain help from this celestial healing collective within us. Awesome. Just awesome. So as I mentioned before, oh, another question coming in too. As I mentioned before, awareness folds in on itself. We access the various areas of our celestial healing collective, which, as I mentioned, sits at the causal level of self, by turning attention to that area. For some of us, we've known that area as the finest level of feeling, right? That's a familiar name, finest level of feeling. So within the context of the finest level of feeling, there are larger and smaller expressions of self. The reason I'm smiling is because we access these larger and smaller areas of self, and we explore the mechanics of the gap between unmanifest and manifest, between, infinite silence and warmed up silence. And then also in the causal level of the physiology, where we go from expressions of self that are like yourself to expressions of self that are like realms, right in there, right in that area where I mentioned that we find the gods. That's the area where the very same kind of transformation that takes place in the gap between infinite silence and warmed up infinite silence, that same process is reflected and expressed at that level of the causal body between the forms of self that are like me and the forms of self that are me as a region or a realm. There's something interesting is happening. There's a dynamic that's happening there, and we can talk about it in those terms because that's a little bit more accessible than talking about it in the extreme abstract of silence folding in on itself, witnessing itself, and giving rise to the threefold structure, and that gives rise to a sixfold structure, which gives rise to a tenfold structure, and on and on. It's very kind of intellectual, and we're at the point of our artwork. We're creating it as an artwork where we're enjoying more the blissful, the pop music, and making things look like things. You know, like our painting looked like this last night, and now today we want it to look more defined. We want to see all the pretty flowers. So in that point between the gods and the realms, really within the hearts of the gods, the God, in that point, we explore. Every one of us has been exploring for decades in the junction between dreaming and sleeping. The junction between dreaming and sleeping. What happens in that junction? For those who have awareness in deep sleep, awareness in deep sleep, anyone? Awareness in deep sleep? Oh, we got some little fingers up. That's good. Oh, hand raised, yes. So for those, oh, yay. Yay. Oh, yay. I love you guys. Beautiful. So for those with awareness in deep sleep, what we do in deep sleep is we move from the quiet to a state of deep quiet in the body, deep healing silence, into the first warmed up expression. Thank you. There's a chat that just came in and said she loves being part of this so much. Oh, I love you being here. So, just in case this little box is going to show on the, closing it there. All right. So we're in deep sleep, in deep silence. And then the deep silence starts to wake up into dreaming. At first, it doesn't become full dreaming. At first, it becomes, oh, I'm really glad I picked this background. At first, it becomes something like this area of my backdrop. For those of you who can't see this, you'll have to catch it on the replay. That it's that first division into three becomes very abstract, very soft expressions of three values that interact harmoniously. For me, when I first noticed it years ago, it looked like getting my mouse out of the middle of my nose here. Let's see, how do we get that mouse out of there? Okay, thank you. Go sit over there. Okay. That first warming up from deep sleep into dreaming was like being in an ocean of color or something. It was just very sort of soft, abstract, not well defined, forms which still made sense to me. You know, like just a warmth, a warm color or a cool color. And then the colors started to associate with specific, I would say, definitions of feeling. The warm color would make me feel a certain way. The cool color would make me feel a certain different way, like that. But simple, right? Simple, basic, like when you were a little kid and you were playing with finger paints or something, you had red and yellow and blue. And you can do anything you want with them. And what you discovered was if I started mixing red and yellow and blue, I got brown. But also what we discovered was we started to get these very interesting, there'd be places in the painting where you get really interesting effects. You know, you get some red, but then some blue would go over part of it. And it would crackle apart a little bit and you get a little bit of red coming through the blue like that, you know? So over time, the awareness starts to define those abstract elements, those three abstract elements, and starts combining them in different ways to produce something that's more concrete, something that looks like the dream of a flower, right? So this is where we experiment. This is where we play. It's completely safe. And in this part of the webinar, healing for everyone in the webinar in their junction between deep sleep and dream, to wake it up. We're waking up the soul of the seer. Yesterday, we defined Shanmuka. There's a name. There's their names, skanda. They're different names for the seer, but it doesn't matter. The important thing is this knower of reality is the essential self. And the essential self is present at every point of your reality, including the deepest part of deep sleep. So from the deepest part of deep sleep, from the deep silence, he awakens, she awakens, they awaken, they awaken. This is one, I would say, possibly the greatest and most important essential player in your celestial healing collective is the knower, the seer, the witnesser, the eye of the eye. And what we're doing is it's going into the gap. I'm seeing it affecting the hippocampus for in people's brains. Hippocampus also looks like cerebellum. Also, I'm seeing a line of energy moving from the back of the head up through to the Ajna chakra. So the Ajna chakra is receiving a download right now regarding the specifics of owning full wakefulness in the junction between deep sleep and dream state. And this awakening that's occurring in the brain, it's like a little rewiring is taking place there. And there are little, several different things. There's bliss in it. It's opening up the dopaminergic pathways. And this is a healing for that part of the physiology for those who have any little tendencies or moving in any way towards PD or anything like that. That's clearing that. Also, flags are being set up, little like road markers, if you will, something like that. Some kind of little points of reference are being set up for each person so that the point of reference triggers when we start to move from deep sleep to dream. So that we have what it does is it supports that. It's like a little reminder. It's like a little gift of bliss that you get at that moment that lets you wake up enough that you get to just really enjoy the process, witness the process, but not so much that it jars a person out of sleep by any means. In fact, the rest in the body deeper, right? The rest in the body going deeper, going deeper, going deeper, going deeper. I'm looking at the physiology, also for people who have sleep anomalies or sleep concerns with their sleep patterns. Here, what I'm seeing for those who have concerns with their sleep patterns is that there is a structure of the Celestial Healing Collective, Nidra, which is responsible for sleep. It's like an overseeing intelligence for sleep. It's really a mode of functioning of the human nervous system. Nidra is a mode of functioning of our human nervous systems, which is both a mode of functioning, but also a lively, intelligent, sentient expression of self. Oh, looking at our 7 sheaths of the causal body, Nidra sits. I'm asking, I've never asked this before. Thank you, everyone, for this healing, because I'm getting it too, right? So I get to sleep well too. Yay. Nidra sits near the outer edges of the 2nd sheath. So Nidra is very, very close to the 3rd sheath of the causal body. And what I'm seeing, and this is me learning right now, something I didn't know before, but as soon as I put my attention, I turned my attention, my awareness into Nidra, and what I see is that she says, feminine, it's a feminine form. She says, I have a range. I'm not just in the 3rd sheath and I'm not just in the 2nd sheath. I have a range. That makes sense. And she also says she has a realm. She has realms that are her specific realms where she likes to hang out. Very cool. So these parameters for this structure, which is responsible for luscious, deep, nourishing, rejuvenating sleep, are being defined for everyone in this healing session, so that all of our sleeps are upgraded and improved. Falling asleep is easier, being there is deeper, even having awareness there is better. There's less waking up in the night. If you do happen to wake up, the sleep comes again very easily. Nice, long, 8.5, 9-hour sleeps, luscious. Waking up feeling rejuvenated. I'm seeing a bunch of questions coming in, so I'm going to get to those next. But I just want to say one more thing about the Celestial Healing Collective. And it's a very interesting point, is that I mentioned that all of the Celestial Healing Collective is an expression of one's own self. It can be identified and located in the physiology. So that's very cool. But the other thing that's interesting about it is I wanted to bring in this concept of the x-axis that ranges from really awful to really wonderful, and say that the forms that we use in energy healing, I'm getting a download. Oh, even before I finish my sentence. The forms that we use in energy healing, those aspects, divine, heavenly, angelic, godlike aspects of self, they tend to reside, like Nidra was saying, she resides in a particular realm or range. Oh, let's see, that was my hellish range. Let's go over here to the heavenly range. So reside just in a portion of that x-axis. This is why it makes sense that those beings that we have so revered and so adored and set up a loving relationship with over the centuries, why we are not tiny, small, insignificant beings compared to that aspect of ourself. Because as humans, I've said this many times, we own the whole x-axis. We own the whole thing. And balance can be, a balance point is the point where we connect in with wholeness or totality, with the source of creation. So essentially, even when you're being gripped by the worst of symptoms or pain or discord, balance even can be found there. Balance can be found at any point along the x-axis. This is a little bit new from what I was saying before. Before I was saying, well, you've got your hell and you've got your heaven and you got to find yourself in the middle. Yes, that's also true, but it's also very important to know that wholeness and totality is present at every point. So even in the grip of the worst conditions and situations, balance can still be found. And from that balance, the counterpart arrives, the antidote, the completion to the incompletion. So these structures, angels, gods, ascended masters, great beings of all various types, they reside in this gentle, loving range, the softer end of the x-axis.